Buenas tardes a todos. Es un placer estar con ustedes desde Montevideo, moderando este panel.
Good evening. It's a pleasure being from Montevideo. And this panel with teachers that have been reflecting about teaching teachers and teacher training. This panel is integrated by Cristina Boccia, Professor Meg Gebhard, Professor of University of Córdoba, José, Herazo, and the Professor Mary. When we proposed this group of experts to reflect about linguistic in their teacher training, we asked them a couple of questions. The main one was, which were the challenges in this historical context in teacher training? I invite the panelists to share their theories.
Laura, no se escucha. Laura. Unmute, sorry.
Decía que en 1978, en su libro El lenguaje como semiótica,
1978, Language as Semiotic, Halliday mentioned that the challenge is answer the questions of the users and not of the language and not the linguist, because he conceived it systemic functional linguistic as language in use and not as a formal study of a language. In 2008, Halliday points out that linguistic that is applied is a theory that allows you to explore the different uses of a language theoretically informed. In the same text, he explains that a theory is a strategic tool for action. That's why Halliday says that an applied theory, this is present in the fourth panelists. And with this, we're going to start with the first panel. We invite everyone to ask questions that we're going to have at the end of the fourth panelist. You can use the YouTube chat to do that. Next, we will hear Professor Meg Gebhard. Meg, all yours.
I'm sharing my screen now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias to Mariana and Laura for this invitation, and to everyone for doing the behind-the-scenes work to make a virtual, multilingual SFL conference free and available to everyone, despite all the challenges of doing so. We have all sorts of discourses, neoliberal ones in particular, that would prevent us from doing such things, ideologies around national languages and such. But I really want to thank you for this opportunity. So the title of my talk is Engaging with Critiques of SFL Pedagogy, Anchoring the Teaching and Learning Cycle in Students' Linguistic and Cultural Resources. And I will be reading my presentation mostly, because I want to make sure I have plenty of time for other speakers, because I can go off on a tangent easily. So the overview here, I'll review some past critiques of SFL. Some of them you'll be very familiar with. The one in particular that I'll be focusing on has been emerging lately, particularly in the field of applied linguistics and the Conference of the American Association of Applied Linguistics at a panel last year, where the idea of SFL as being racist came up. And I really wasn't able to formulate much of a response at that time. And so I've used this opportunity to do that. I'll be, in my response, I'll be talking about how I'm proposing something called the expanded teaching and learning cycle, which is an SFL-informed approach to teacher education. And third, I was going to have a couple examples. I'll really just focus on one of a pre-service teacher trying to use this approach. And last, I'll touch very briefly on some implications of this. If I do run out of time, it really is about using an SFL-informed approach to teacher education to combat systemic racism and other inequities, particularly given the strength of neoliberal discourses. Some of these critiques you're familiar with, the idea that SFL meta-language is overwhelming for teachers and non-linguists. I think over the years, there's been numerous studies by people on this panel, people at this conference who have really dismissed that idea, that some modified approach to SFL meta-language and taking a little meta-language can really take teachers quite far. The second objection is that SFL pedagogy lends itself to formalism and stifles creativity. Again, we've seen numerous presentations at this conference and number of presentations in journals and in book form that really challenge that idea as well. And then the third critique, and this comes from Alan Luke and others, is that SFL, critical scholars, SFL's approach to situated practice and disciplinary genres and overt instruction in the linguistic features of these genres will not necessarily support the redistribution of economic and social status that theoretically accompanies access and the ability to use these discourses of power. Well, there's no argument from me on that. As evidence on Wednesday evening session on the role of linguistics in times of systemic collapse, we saw evidence of this. In that session, success or the failure of specific SFL projects was attributed to luck, the presence or absence of charismatic leadership, as well as institutional supports that can open up and shut down rather quickly, and the degree to which projects included the perspectives and the voices of those it was intended to benefit. And I think this could be said of any project. This is certainly not unique to SFL. However, I would argue that SFL's conception of grammar as a social semiotic system affords teachers and students the possibility of exploring power dynamics in texts and in institutional contexts if we consider the alternatives. And those alternatives, namely, are Skinnerian behavioral approaches to grammar, which have been we've been socialized into and are really hard to combat, as well as more, a psycholinguistic Chomskyan perspective that says, well, grammar will develop naturally on its own. And I don't think either of those perspectives on grammar are that useful to teachers and students, particularly when it comes to exercising agency. The last critique here is SFL's dichotomous conceptualization of the differences between everyday and academic language is racist, and it contributes to the construction of ratio-linguistic ideologies. And for those of you new to this critique, I'll highlight an article here written by Nelson Flores, that really captures this perspective in clear ways. And he makes a couple points I'll summarize here, that you've got this SFL's dichotomous framing of the differences between everyday and academic language is racist. It doesn't acknowledge the complex ways that multilingual youth of color use language and other meaning systems in and outside of school. It results in deficit forms of remediation and leaves larger structural inequities in schools unchallenged. And I'll show you how he writes about this. He states, "My contention is that academic language is not of a list of empirical linguistic practices, but rather a ratio-linguistic ideology that frames the home language practice of racialized communities as inherently deficient. From this perspective, whether one is positioned as successfully engaged in academic language is primarily determined by the white listening reading subject." And he's writing particularly in a US context, and the perceptions that have shaped the histories of colonialism that continue to racialize speakers as coming from communities with linguistic deficiencies that need to be policed and corrected. Considering the important role of the white listening speaking subject, the teacher educator, the policy maker, he said it's insufficient and perhaps misguided for educational linguists, that would be people like me, people like you perhaps, to compile supposed linguistic features of academic language and introduce them to educators. Instead, the role of the educational linguist should be to support educators in developing new listening and reading subject positions that recognize the complex linguistic knowledge that students have developed as part of their lived experiences. My response to Flores is that I don't think he's wrong. In a US context, he is not wrong. Decontextualized conceptions of academic versus everyday language have been institutionalized in teacher education. Now, I don't think SFL talks more about a Klein. Certainly, there isn't this, this dichotomy that he talks about. I think he's off on that. But we do have that in teacher education, the idea of Bix and Kalps that's been in Cummins' work, certainly in Swear's work on academic language, where that is the case. I think teachers in the US are primarily white, middle-class, monolingual speakers of English, who have been socialized into form-focused conceptions of grammar, vocabulary-based conceptions of academic language, and an English-only approach, sometimes militantly so, that does stigmatize other languages and varieties of English, African-American English, if you think about the work of Baker Bell. And historically, we've had very weak investments in teacher education. And as a result, there's kind of a maintenance of these hegemonic discourses and the status quo. And I think SFL scholarship has not focused on issues of race in a substantive way, despite systemic forms of racism that are just endemic to institutions in the US, not just education. I think Catherine Corso and Jason Mizell, who organized the panel last year to address this issue, are really pointing us in some interesting new directions. And however, rather than unwittingly and perhaps cavalierly dismissing nearly 50 years of research and engagement in schools, I suggest a revision of SFL's teaching and learning cycle, an institutional recommitment, a radical recommitment to what teacher education is. And I think this involves supporting teachers and drawing on students' meaning-making resources and identities in designing culturally sustaining pedagogy. This is very hard work, but not impossible. We see this in Ruth Harmon's work in Georgia, and I'm speaking in a US context specifically, where issues of racism take a particular construction. Maria Briff's presentation today about Boston City schools Cecilia Colombi, Diana Gomez, and Sarah Wagner's presentation today, all focusing on the teaching of Spanish as a heritage language in the U.S., are all examples of robust ways that we can go about that kind of work. There's also the importance of coupling qualitative and ethnographic case studies of students' academic literacy development, their trajectory through school and at home, in the community, at work, with SFL tools to support pre- and in-service teachers in developing a much deeper understanding of the semiotic resources students bring to school, so that we can expand on, not replace, the resources they bring. And certainly this isn't the job of one teacher, right, to do this ethnographic work, design lessons. There has to be support from the university, from teacher educators and researchers. And we've seen this work with people on this panel. Mary Schleppegrell's work, beginning with the history project and the publication of the language of schooling, is really what started me on SFL. In addition, I think there's a need to challenge these deficit ideologies about teachers. I think there's a lot about that's written about what teachers can't do, won't do, that actually just isn't really the case. Teachers can act as change agents when they're supported in designing SFL curriculum, instruction and assessment, by providing them with a functional meta language to do that kind of critical language awareness work with students. And it also relates to how we recruit, fund, and support teachers. I think that's a big issue as well. If we're really trying to focus on the subject position of the white monolingual English-only teacher, we can expand that. That's not a given. And I've tried to pull these ideas together in a book I published in 2019. And this builds on an enormous body of research produced primarily by SFL scholars, but certainly others internationally. And this book is based on 30 years of my work in under-resourced public school as an ESL teacher in a middle school, then work as a researcher, and continuing my work as a researcher and teacher educator. And through this, I've attempted to introduce teachers to a Hallidean conception of text, context, dynamics. Oops, I think we missed one here. So depending on the candidate pathway, the teachers with whom I work, they take 1, 2, or 3 courses with me. And within these courses, beginning at the center of this diagram, we explore the idea that oral, written, and computer-mediated texts are often multimodal and multilingual, and that grammar is a social semiotic practice. It's a socio-semiotic system, not a formal system of rules that operate at the sound, word, or sentence level, and certainly not something that's going to develop all by itself. So we analyze the genre and register features of high-stakes types of text that these teacher candidates or teachers, that their students are required to read, write, and critically discuss in their discipline. In addition, I introduce teachers to a commensurate theory of development that builds on the scholarship of those who have productively coupled Halliday's work with Vygotskian conception of language and development. And an article that I really am so thankful was written is by Jenny Hammond. The whole notion of high challenge and high supports is really very, very useful. And last, I require teachers to attend to the institutional structures, the historic and economic political forces that shape their work. When they transition into the classroom, they become aware of these. They can't always name these forces that are constraining their ability to be creative, their ability to connect with students, but we can do that with them. And when they can name these forces, and begin to think about them, they can understand what forces are constraining their students' literacy practices in school. And along the way, they could target something specific that they could potentially transform, some inequity that they can address. That this isn't change with a big C, it's change with a little c. Apply to the teacher education. I've taken the steps of the teaching and learning cycle and I've augmented them. So now there are 10 stages of this, 10 steps to this process. And it begins with extensive planning that includes knowing and drawing on students' linguistic and cultural resources. What was that?
5 minutes left.
Yep. Okay. And investments. Then using these tools to prepare model text with key genre and register features annotated and creating assessments that are aligned with those. And then another piece of this that's different is students use the teaching and learning cycle. It's you can see through steps 3, building the field, through 6 in more conventional ways. But we always really encourage teachers to have an authentic audience for students' work. And having this authentic audience is essential because it really makes conversations about linguistic choices really prevalent in a particular authentic context of situation, rather than a contrived simulation or for the sole purpose of getting a grade, which certainly is no small matter, but that authentic audience seems pivotal. I also encourage them, with the support of doctoral students, to share their work at local conferences, international conferences, and to bring the work forward to publish their findings. And an example, just very quickly, of what this looks like. There are 3 examples I had in these slides, and they come from a book I'm editing with Catherine Accorso right now of teachers who have taken up some version of this. But in the interest of time, I'll just go to this last one. And this is Nick Blaisdell. Nick uses this approach in teaching 10th grade multilingual students how to write persuasive letters to their administrator to combat the school's really draconian hoodie policy during his practicum experience. And hoodies are sweatshirts with a hood. They're, from the school's perspective, they're associated with potential violence and hiding your identity. And Nick was, and what was happening is, well, I'll just tell you a little bit about Nick. As an undergrad, Nick had taken 3 SFL courses with me, as well as social justice education courses with my colleague, Dr. Keisha Green. Based on these courses, during his student teaching experience, he designed, implemented, and reflected on students' literacy practice in the context of writing letters to address this dress code. And this dress code would lead to confrontations in the hallway, really contentious relationships between students and teachers, administration students. Students would get, instruction was interrupted, people were suspended. So drawing on, you can see here in the middle, drawing on Sally Humphrey's work, particularly this idea of paragraphing with a point, elaborate, evidence, and link. And Nick was really drawn to genre. He a little less so on register, but he found this very productive to working with students and supporting them in writing letters to administrators and eventually having the hoodie policy repealed. And I'll just read you an example here. And this is from a student who never turned in work, was absent frequently. And he said, one reason why we shouldn't have a dress code is because students feel cold because of the temperature outside. They feel cold, and I should also say that it's really cold in New England, and the heating system in the school was broken. They feel cold because they come to school with temperatures below 0 degrees, and automatically they walk through the door and they have to take off the hoodie or coat because they don't want to get sent home or to in-school suspension. In other schools, there's also the problem. And then he tries to take a quote from an article that they had analyzed. In 2014, New Jersey middle schoolers fed up with being shamed for wearing uncomfortable clothes during warm weather. So he has that, and then he has this hashtag, and he tries to, not very effectively, but an effort. He says, hence, our students should create a similar campaign to remove the uniform policy. And indeed it was. So with my, what do I have, 1 minute left?
Exactly.
Okay. So returning to Flores's language about creating new learning and reading subject positions for pre and in-service teachers, I would say first, we really need to leverage the university resources that we have in recruiting students from other departments into education, in designing our courses and developing these partnerships and collaborating with colleagues in other departments, linguistic anthropology and sociology. We also need to fund and recruit we need to fund these students once they get here. I don't think we need any more dining halls that look like the Hilton, sport fields that look like, pro teams could play on them. I think we really need to really diversify the teaching force and support multilingual doctoral students who can then support teachers. This goes beyond the little TA experience that you get to really have that apprenticeship in teaching and research. And then we need to name some of these neoliberal discourses that are certainly getting in the way of my work. 20 years at the University of Massachusetts, I've really seen privatization, standardization, assessment systems, shrinking down the teacher ed program to as few weeks as possible to make it more affordable, but not really giving them much in the way that would help them move into the classroom and stay there. So I will end there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Meg. Muchas gracias. Bueno, aquí la profesora Meg Gebhard.
Thank you very much, Meg. She proposed answers to voices that request answers to ideologies, and she proposes a space for these voices and redirect the focus of teachers. Somehow this presentation retakes Viviana Resende's points about critically positioning and taking ownership of our own power to generate change. We will return about this on the questions. Let's have now José David Herazo. Thank you very much, Laura. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Thank you. Well, again, thank you very much for this invitation to this Congress. That's been wonderful. A lot of learning in these 3 days and the previous courses. I'm speaking from the University of Córdoba in Colombia. We've been having a lot of questions about where is this situated because of the place in Argentina. We are in Colombia. Recently, we have been asking about the processes of teacher education, and that led me to the topic that I want to discuss today. Those are interventions, formative interventions in pedagogy. When I say our reflections, I'm talking about the team that I'm part of with teachers, colleagues of the university and colleges that we've been working in these topics about since 3 or 4 years, and I thank them for that. It's well known that the change, educative change, requires a mediation of the presence of the teachers in the classroom in order to take it to happen. We can say literally that the change, the educative change falls in the teachers who are responsible of mediation between theories and methods and what's going on in our classrooms. I believe that our community understood that systemic functional linguistic and each process of implementation of genre pedagogy includes a stage of teaching and how we train our teachers to use the pedagogy. Works of Rose Acevedo and his team brought a new model of teaching that is called scaffolding, following the same principles of the pedagogy of reading to learn. So the didactic practice that the teachers are meant to learn. And then in the second stage, the teachers are use two stages. The first, I do, you watch. The second one is you do, I help, to emphasize the scaffolding and help and support to the student. And then a moment where teachers do an assessment of a proposal and the practice that they call you do, I watch. Just like this work, many other works in this area, most of them, I would say, are done by the people that are in this Congress.
En el Brasil. Han venido también adelantando procesos de formación docente.
All of them are bringing teaching education and how linguists and their experience in systemic functional linguistic are bringing works that are situated in the schools in different contexts. Today we had, I forgot their name. We saw a wonderful work online about material production. Christian, that's his name, this morning. Those are longitudinal processes. If all of these jobs works that the pedagogy and the meta language of the systemic functional linguistic help to improve the learning experience of students. In this group, we have come up with some questions or entanglements, how Jillian would call them, that point out the fact that many of these works, they are not defined explicitly what the teacher change has been. With these results, we say that the different practices of the pedagogy, it's very weirdly explicitly how the teaching has been changed. The big change that Meg just talked, that has to do with the reorganization of the teaching and with the identity, these aspects that go beyond implementation of strategies. Many of these works spoke about the conflicts or tensions that teachers see. And generally, there is a list of these works that are presented, like in some cases anecdotically, like this, what kind of difficulties they find when applying the pedagogy, but little is explained what is the role of this type of conflict in the teacher development. And lastly, we feel that it maintains the idea that the investigator is the expert and the student is the rookie that needs to be trained, that needs to be taught in the didactical practice of the pedagogy in order to use that on their own. Product of this questions, we have come up with some questions in the University of Córdoba in Colombia that have to do with the following questions that are the main focus. What are the changes on the teaching practice when we to bring it to the classroom? We've had chances of showing these in the individual sessions yesterday, so I'm going to mention them briefly. Other question is, what do we understand for change or transformation, teaching transformation? And what is the conflict role or the tension role? And then how can we achieve this change and maintain it in time? Not only to have it to not only for the investigators, but in order to use the practice, the genre pedagogy and the teaching practice. So we did a project on critical reading in the university. We worked with different teachers in different areas. Only one of them was from language, didactic, sociology. And we tried to see critical reading. And it was originally thought to be done on a face-to-face basis, but we had to change it to do it remotely with many difficulties, as Jillian explained this morning. So the first thing I want to talk about is the question about how are we conceptualizing the change or the teaching transformation with capital T. We have a social political position that is anchored in our academic field, and that is the expansive learning concept. That means that learning implies the transformation of the action that goes beyond competence or concepts. It's a more complex and that implies the transformation of the person that learns expansively and transforms. Sanino mentions that this type of learning applies three systems: system of activity expanded, theoretical practice, and renovated agency. We have been reflecting about this. Those are the human interactions starts with a dialectical network of the social context, including the person or the subject, that is taken into account for the analysis. This subject, the teacher, aims at an object, and their goal is for the student to learn. An object could be the learning of critical reading of the students. To achieve it, they use different tools like genre pedagogy offers, and certain rules that are embedded in the class as part of a community or a group of people oriented to the same object. And lastly, with division of responsibility and authority that belong to the work spread. We have what's changing other than mediation when the systemic functional linguistic and genre pedagogy it's brought up. This example is a result of an analysis with the teachers of the project that I just mentioned, and here they came up how they perceived their praxis. Focus on the discipline teaching and taking reading, critical reading as a product that it's acquired by teaching the discipline to students. After this process, the system changed, and that's why we call it an expanded system, starting because the object changed, considering critical reading as the object of their teaching. This teacher summarizes very graphically. We brought two stars of one look. Not only we taught disciplinary, but we can actually explain critical reading in our classroom. And this change generates an enormous change. And that's why we speak about a system of activity that is renewed or expanded. It's a new system where critical reading was implicit and additional and became something that is fundamental. I'm not presenting this as results, but as hints of what we're learning, and that is that teachers start learning in consequence to reach that goal and starting to getting involved in text analysis and selecting the texts very carefully and accompanying the students and their reading, which is something that they didn't do at the beginning. The teachers used to ask students that they would read individually, and after that, the teachers in the classroom would ask questions to check comprehension. That changed, and the teachers started to accompanying students to help them. And that's why we talk about renewed agency in that sense, and in the sense of improving ourselves and using these strategies little by little, and being more confident and transforming their own practice. An essential point of this expansive learning is that teachers started to theorize their practice, and they took it as an object of reflection and analysis in the groups that we had weekly or biweekly. Like in this image, for example, they're analyzing their practice with their theoretical activities to identify where were the problems or the contradictions that kept the student from learning critical reading. So the first question on how are we learning, or what's change, or what's transformation? We're learning it as expansive. So very quickly, to answer the question of how we're trying to do this change, we are using formative interventions. The teachers participate very actively. First of all, it's an ethnography practice. So we learn from their practice, their lives, their day-to-day lives. We do interviews, we do observations, and then we start a series of learning that we call sessions of learning, meetings with teachers where they would question their own praxis using examples or materials of activities. Like in here, for instance, teacher number 1, it's speaking about his own critical reading, and after that we move to the analysis. We try to analyze these problems and contradictions that we've identified. Where are they coming from? What's the story? What are the elements that inflect in this contradiction? One of the problems in this example is that teachers don't read, or they will not read, and they do have their bias as to what critical reading is. The third action is modulation, and they are asked a renewed model of the practice. So we know what's the problem, we identified it, and now what are we going to do to surpass this? And then we take the proposal of the investigators of the North University with this list that you will see on the slide, with the aim of writing and reading critically. We worked with the teachers in only one cycle of reading to learn, and it was to find which were the stages that were going to be done synchronically or asynchronically. Unfortunately, due to connection problems, most of them were asynchronic,
Y por último, los docentes pues participan
Lastly,
de
the teachers participate of discussions and reflections on their implementation, and they identify benefits, like the first testimony that we see here. One of them say that I'm going to steal this methodology because it was really good. I'm going to continue to apply it and build it from there. What are the conclusions, the preliminary conclusions? The change on the praxis, it's a lot more than taking meta-language skills, and it implies a lot of other aspects that we're not taking into account, and we have to investigate more. Learning of the teachers was moved by contradictions that they found and they wanted to solve. The formative interventions are really useful to create community and investigation. The teachers, they do their own analysis of their own practice, and then we present in congresses like this. What's pending is the change and how that is going to remain in time, and identity development. It's been a learning experience, as everything, right? When we work collectively with ups and downs, but I think that we are learning every moment of each one of the process. Thank you very much. Did I? Professor Herazo proposes explore expansive learning, design teaching programs according to the formative model, and has this the expansive that is also present and in Meg's learning process, and puts on the center this scaffolding of teachers to start with systemic functional linguistics. So let's see what Cristina Boccia is proposing right now. Cristina, all yours.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Estoy re contenta de estar acá.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here.
Todo bien. Ahora con mi presentación voy a compartir pantalla.
I'm going to start sharing my screen.
Ustedes me avisan, por favor, si sale bien.
Let me know if you can see it.
Perfecto. Sí, está. ¿Estamos bien? Muy bien. Bueno, muy bien. De nuevo, gracias por la invitación.
Once again, thank you for your invitation.
Bueno, como les decía al principio, voy a pasar al inglés mientras...
And I will switch to English while presenting.
Con el que trabajo en inglés, pero luego paso...
After that, I'll switch back to Spanish to answer some of your questions, or if we need to.
Of the work we have been doing in Mendoza, working with EFL teachers. And I would like to today foreground the importance of the contextual and functional nature of our proposal, as we usually take a view from above as we plan our work with teachers. And the need to always take teachers' knowledge on language, on their learning practice, and on the materials that they currently use as our starting point. That's, where we anchor our practice. Just very briefly, our local context. We have been working with genre pedagogy and EFL teacher and teaching and learning, professional development, especially for public education, especially in high school. That is our highest population in public schooling in Argentina. And we work with teachers in workshops from the university. We go to schools. we are, let's say, very opportunistic in this sense. Whatever opportunity arises, we take it, and we try to work as much as we can with teachers. We're very happy institutionally. This would be one of the gains, as Jim was telling us. Institutionally, we were able to get a full course as a requirement in the teacher training at our teacher training college starting this August, that we have all the future teachers for 3 months working with us just before they graduate, and this is fantastic for us. So one of the first ideas I wanted to share with you is how we try to make the most of the contextual and functional aspect of our proposal. So stratification, metafunction, and choice are ways into the theory. We find that they're one of the most, let's say, the friendliest ways to enter the theory, that resonate with intuitive ideas that teachers already have about the language. And so we move from the ideas of genre to register, and we of course work with the idea of genre and Martin's his working definition of it. And register is extremely powerful with our work with teachers. Teachers here are trained to contextualize their teaching practice, to contextualize what they do in the classroom, but they have never been really taught what it means to contextualize. So the register has helped us to flesh out in delicacy what it means to contextualize their teaching practice. So very, very simply put, we would work with teachers, discussing the social activity in the culture, the social activity in a particular situation. Then we would always move through meanings or functions. Sometimes we talk about functions that are fulfilled in texts that seem a little more concrete than meanings. Sometimes meanings seem a little abstract to them, and then the wordings or the expressions that they would use. So for example, in a buying-selling transaction, in a particular contextual situation, and then we would work with, what are the functions that need to be fulfilled, the meanings that need to be made, and only then will we move on to the wordings. Yeah, so we insist on this a lot. This gives us a little more work. It's a little more challenging in theoretical terms, but and this we do not just because we think it's sound conceptually, but it's also very productive in terms of how teachers start to map what they will be teaching. So, for example, if teachers are about to teach an anecdote, and one of the functions, obviously, they have to fulfill, students will have to fulfill, is to express attitude effectively. This would be the function or the meaning that needs to be made. And this allows us to work better with the concept of choice, right? So what are the choices that we have in order to express this meaning? And at different levels of instruction, students will probably be writing anecdotes from a pre-intermediate student who will be writing a simple anecdote, but attitude will be expressed. The repertoire of choices will be more reduced, less sophisticated, but later on, when an anecdote is written again, maybe in an intermediate level of instruction, the repertoire will become more varied, will become more sophisticated. So having this idea of a stable approach, thinking about functions or meanings is very good in operational terms. So this combination of stratification, metafunction, and choice is our view from above is very productive for us, even when we cannot always work, and we usually cannot work with functional grammar with it. So they will still be working with their own conceptions, typically structuralist on grammar and lexis, but already that view from above changes their whole perception. So this would be our kind of thinking of Mary Mack and Horaric, our good enough framework. And this contextual and functional perspective also works very well for us because we articulate it with a teaching learning cycle, and obviously they work happily together. Another idea that that has helped us, particularly in the last years, to make our contact with teachers as effective as we can, is to take the contents, the teaching practices, the general conception of language that teachers have and are familiar with as our starting point, and to always work with them in terms of, we're changing focus. We're not just radically replacing what you've been doing with new practices altogether. So we work a lot once we have introduced this functional, contextual view from above of what we will be doing with the contents that would typically appear in a course book. I don't expect us to be able to see, but I think we recognize this as what a course book list of contents would look like. And in our local context, teachers do use or work with commercial textbooks all the time. So what we, as we analyze this with them, we obviously come to the conclusion that the books, the way that the organizing principle of these course books is, of course, grammar oriented. Yes, it is the grammar and the lexis that are the undisputed core or organizing principle of what is going on. And the production of texts, typically written text, towards the left, end of the unit, when teachers are exhausted and running out of time. So what we try to do with teachers is to think, particularly in public education, in which maybe they will be covering out of this whole book 4 units, with crowded classrooms and a couple of hours a week with students. Well, maybe from the 4 units, 3 genres can be taught. It could be the genres that are actually proposed in the units themselves, or maybe they are genres that the teacher studying the contents of what is happening within the unit can propose. So what we suggest is that teachers, and this is what we work we work together for this to happen, have their parallel text-based syllabus, yes, that accompanies the work that they will be doing with the course books. So for example, in this case, from unit 1 to 4, maybe they'll just be working with a recount, a description that later becomes a report. Okay, so this is very important to us because course books are part of what happens in EFL teaching and learning. So this would be another way that we work with them, around certain content like places, festivals, animals, food. What would be genres that would work with them? What would be the functions? What are the lexicogrammatical exponents? Yeah, so always reasoning along these terms, mapping it on to the course book that they will be using. Now, in terms of the micro-planning of the lessons within these course books, we also try to take those lessons as our starting point, yeah? So what we try to do once we introduce the genre teaching learning cycle, and we try to help them to understand really the conception, the idea of the cycle, and why we go through these stages, scaffolding, students' way towards autonomy. We also we try to see how we can map the cycle onto the design of the course books, because the course books will be used. Yeah, so if we can imagine that these 4 spreads are the pages in a unit, yeah, we analyze them with them, and they're pretty predictable and pretty stable from editorial to editorial. So we have typically an initial introduction to subject matter with a lot of vocabulary that is included, probably some structures, comprehension questions, and then maybe even more subject matter, introduced comprehension questions, and then the big language focus, right? A lot of work with language at a sentence level, sometimes at textual level, but a lot of work with the grammar that is the interest really of the unit. Then we can move on maybe to some oral work, some more content, and then finally towards the production of text, which would be the very last page with the green heading at the top. This particular unit, in this particular unit, students will write a profile or a bio recount. There is some guidance to it, but what we try to show them is that in this organization can, and I'm showing this in this next slide in very simple terms, we can map on the idea of, well, initially we'll be building field, building subject matter on the, around the content that you will in the end be writing on. Then there will be a lot of deconstruction of language at first, because this is, a lot of what interests, this is basically what interests what is of interest in the unit, but we do that work. And as teachers, we know where we're going. So if we know what genre we want to write, we want our students to produce. So we may reinforce, we may foreground some of the practice, we may add some work in this deconstruction stage with language, and then we move towards that final area, final section of the course book in which typically a sample text is introduced. We can use that sample section. We can replace it if we think it's not a good example of what, for example, a prototypical bio recount is. In this particular case, we have a little bit of modeling, but here would come the deconstruction, that we do of the text itself. Yes, and then, well, I'm simplifying this a lot, but then we would move on. We can move on to joint construction and independent construction. But we realize that mapping on, that making this the cycle articulate with what they have to actually use was essential if we wanted to bringing the cycle into the classes. But we are moving beyond grammar much more than they were before, when, once students did the language focus exercises, typically sentence level, end of unit. We also worked with the contents within the units. We try to study what meanings and what wordings are privileged in the course books that are typically used. We realized, or our first findings were that, well, the construal of representational or experiential meanings are foregrounded over the interpersonal ones. So we started to study, well, what exactly about the interpersonal is included in the lessons and how is it treated. We did a study of 3 course books of a pre-intermediate level. Very briefly, we went over discourse semantic resources of negotiation and appraisal, and we found a very interesting repertoire of resources related to mood, modality, attitude, and even dialogic engagement. So the repertoire was there, sometimes to be explicitly taught, sometimes included in model texts, and expected in the text that students were to write. So what we found was the potential for our intervention was related to the need to change the functionality of those interpersonal resources in terms of the texts in which they were going to be used, and in terms of deciding, well, what are the register variables that will make me choose one or another resource. So it was more of a functional and contextualizing revisiting of these interpersonal resources, much more than adding or changing content. So the genres that are in the textbooks do call for interpersonal meanings. The text that students are expected to write or produce do call for interpersonal meanings, just that these are not always functionally incorporated into the lessons. So, well, this would be an example. I think I'll just mention the fact that we came up with a list of kind of inter and personal meanings that even in a pre-intermediate level of instructions are in the course books, just to be exploited by the teachers. So interpersonal meanings is one of the things that we work as much as we can with teachers. Finally, we tried to took up Halliday's invitation to explore ways in which our SFL perspective can enter into useful dialogue, particularly with other perspectives that are currently observed and very popular in our local context, that are more cognitive and psycholinguistic. There is a program called Plan de Lectura y Escritura Mendoza, both for L1 and L2, that draws very heavily upon the instructional model that proposed by Fisher, Frey, and Lamp. We studied the model in terms of the pedagogical assumptions, key teaching and learning objectives, role of teacher, role of meta-language, and we compared it to reading to learn. And well, this is a general outline of the instructional model. And well, we found what we were trying to determine, what was the common ground that we had with this instructional model, a common ground that we needed strategically as a starting point to start conversations about, working, articulating our more functional approach. So there were things, I think as I don't have that much time, the models had things in common, related to explicit modeling, to teaching guidance and scaffolding in terms of moving towards student autonomy. But there were quite a few that kept both models apart. And, even when we use the topographical representation of pedagogies by Rose and Martin, even when at first we were happy that both these models seemed to converge because of what they had in common in, closer to the bottom right quadrant, upon studying them in more detail, upon observing the instructional model being used in classes by teachers, we realized that, they were quite apart. Basically because the exact object of teaching is not sharply defined in the instructional model. It seems to shunt between the cognitive skills that are being developed and some reference to what the text, how the text is working. There was not a principled cycle in which each phase was nestled carefully and grounded in the previous one. There was not, it does not provide a principled cycle that can be regularly applied by teachers who need themselves a lot of scaffolding. And it's not really grounded in how language works, how texts works. So not really contributing to a visible curriculum in the classroom. So we're taking up the challenge of working in this space that we have been able to identify, and taking Christie's words that, well, this idea that the development of the desired mental skills is entirely dependent on the mastery of the linguistic patterns in which these skills are realized. So, well, I know I'm out of time. I just wanted to go over this idea of how, productive this look from above has been for us, extremely productive. in our teaching, in our working with teachers, how we take their understanding of content of teaching practice, of pedagogy as our starting point, and how we have started to find these common spaces that we can, so we can start conversing with other approaches that are very strong in our local community. Well, obrigado, muchas gracias. Thank you for listening.
Muchas gracias, Cristina. Bueno, la profesora Boccia nos ofrece entonces caminos de cambio a partir de los libros de texto, mirándolos desde una óptica sistémico-funcional y generando espacios para reorganizar.
Generating spaces to reorganize those materials, pedagogical one, looking from a genre perspective. Somehow we're talking about scaffolding in another way, but we're thinking about this similar subject that our colleagues spoke about. So I believe we're going to have a really productive conversation. And to finish, we have Mary Schleppegrell. Of yours.
Am I showing my slides, and can everyone hear me? Great. Well, I want to say thank you also to Mariana and Laura and the other people who've organized this conference. It's been such an interesting experience to hear the panels over the past few days, and how exciting to hear the papers that we've just heard and the presentations. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about work I'm currently doing. Let's see how I change this now. There we go. So the task that they asked us to do as we were preparing to speak here is to think about what key theoretical concepts from SFL are really informing the work that we're doing. And for me, I'm going to take an approach something like the approach of that we just heard from Cristina, of talking about some big SFL concepts that come like from above that help us work with teachers. And for me, some very key foundational concepts that I want to talk about are the idea of language as social semiotic, that is, the power of language itself to shape contexts. And specifically thinking about the cultural context of the classroom and how that relates to the context of culture higher up in education. And most of us who work in education see problems in the context of culture, the context of education that's currently being instantiated in classroom situations. But SFL theory gives us potential ways to make changes in classroom practice along the lines we've just heard about from other people that can contribute back to changes in the larger cultural context. So I think what we've been hearing in the previous presentations is our answers to the questions I have here, whether we can work toward instantiation of meanings in classroom interaction that lead toward changes in the culture. And can we create new contexts of situation in classrooms that enable all students to thrive? So it's a very powerful idea from systemic functional linguistics that language itself is a powerful social semiotic that shapes our culture. And we can have an impact if we can create ongoing disturbances in that larger cultural context through instantiating ways of saying, being, and doing that work against what we might have inherited from the past in our context of culture. So for me, some key SFL concepts for teacher education working in the context of situation have to do with register, echoing really in my talk, I think many things we've already heard, but working with dimensions of field, tenor, and mode that shift the unfolding of the context in the classroom, for example, by centering student talk. That's one example I'll be giving more later. So register, and then discourse semantics and metafunction in engaging students in analysis of texts in order to support their disciplinary learning and ways of thinking. So the project I'm currently working on with my colleague Chauncey Montesano, who's a social studies educator, is to develop curriculum over the past few years for middle school, which is lower secondary, so grade 6th, 7th, and 8th, in social studies. And we're in social studies classrooms that have large numbers of bilingual and multilingual students and students of color. So students who've historically been marginalized in our schools and poorly served. Social studies is a particularly challenging context for many of these students, as the experiences and histories of their communities are often not in focus or are in focus in ways that marginalize or diminish the contributions of their communities. The teachers we work with, like the teachers who've been described in the other talks tonight, want to make changes, and they are aware of these challenges of teaching history and social studies, particularly around issues of race, colonialism, and other historical harms. And they want to be better prepared to talk about these concepts with students and create a context in their classroom where all students can participate. So through design-based research, we've developed curriculum resources, and I can just point to the website, Read, Inquire, Write, up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. There you can find these resources. They're free for downloading and available also in Spanish and Arabic to support some students in our classrooms. And we follow a cycle in social studies that might be familiar to you if you think of a top-down approach from SFL to the classroom. So we start by orienting students to the content in an investigation. So we have sets of investigations, each having a compelling question that doesn't have a right answer, where students are going to write arguments giving their point of view. They orient to content, they read and analyze sources using tools that we've developed to help them think historically and critically and comprehend complex language. Then they weigh and corroborate evidence from the sources to sort them and construct evidence-based arguments. And then through a set of tools, they analyze mentor texts. They make choices themselves to plan and compose and reflect on their writing. So this is a set of curriculum materials that we've spent many years developing. And now we're working in teacher education, thinking about how we prepare teachers to engage in this challenging kind of work in the classroom. And so in working with teachers and developing the investigations, we also had to think about the constraints of our current educational context of culture, where students and teachers come with their own histories and perspectives. The goals of instruction and standards for assessment are given. Teachers need to achieve those. And there are particular pedagogical theories and approaches that are already established. So again, I'm repeating things that other people this evening have already brought out. Our goal then is to support teachers in engaging students in activities that is, create situations that shift current practices in ways that are available to us and teachers are ready to adopt. That includes offering new perspectives on the content in the textbook, promoting student talk during analysis of the texts and sources that they're reading that supports their comprehension and disciplinary ways of thinking. So, in other words, we're trying to shift the register in the classroom and thus create contexts of situation that can redound back to the larger culture and hopefully start bringing about changes bit by bit. So we change the mode by changing participation structures from teacher lecturing, teacher talk, to student talk, more student to student talk. We change the tenor by inviting students' knowledge, not assuming the teacher knows everything about these topics and the students know nothing, but instead assuming that the students bring something from their backgrounds, from their communities, that they can contribute to discussion of the topic, and changing the relationship between teacher and students to create a tenor that invites every voice to participate, and enabling translanguaging where students can draw on their own languages is also part of this. In terms of field, we're working to change the dominant narrative related to the topic of our investigations. So for example, we have an investigation that asks the question, how did Black founders redefine democracy and Black identity in early America? So Dr. LaGarrett King from the Carter Center for K-12 Black History Education has written articles about this concept of Black founders, that there were Black people at the time of the American Revolution and the writing of the Declaration of Independence as the Constitution was written, who were writing letters to Thomas Jefferson and getting engaged with George Washington and others, arguing that they also should be benefiting from these new ideas of freedom. And of course, we know that in fact, that's not what happened. But by presenting the voices of these people and showing students that in fact, in colonial America, there were already people who were arguing against slavery and for democracy for everyone, gives us a different narrative. So we've written, we look at the dominant narrative related to each of our topics, what we call the usual story, and then we present a counter narrative, or what we call another story, about what was going on at that time or how we could think about the topic. And we ask teachers and students to reflect as we get started on what they bring from their background about the topic. So what do they already know? Where did they learn that? Whose voices might be missing from what they know? And again, this gives us a chance to push back on the typical context of culture in the classroom, encouraging students to talk about what they know from their homes and communities, and supporting student talk then throughout the investigation. Students engage with a range of sources throughout an investigation, but they do that by talking together using a tool that we call the bookmark that has a set of questions for them to discuss together in pairs, and then whole group discussion, again, as a way of developing students' voices and giving them the chance to really engage with the ideas. So, for example, we have a disciplinary literacy tool, the bookmark. This is a part of it here that you see on the right. And the students are working in pairs to read a source from the Black Founders investigation, where they're reading the sentences and asking each other the question, what people, institutions, ideas, and systems are actors in this source? And what is the relationship between those people in institutions, ideas, and systems? And so we have a series of questions that are informed by our understanding of systemic functional linguistics that apply in different ways to different kinds of sources. So in the case of proclamations or laws or reports, the question that I just showed you about people and institutions who are actors in the source guides students to start thinking about who was agentive and where was the power in that moment in history that shows up in this source. For narratives, interviews, and some arguments, we ask them to think about a different question, about what they're learning from the text, about what the people or the author think, want, or experience. Again, that's focusing them in on particular verbs and expressions in the text that are going to give them a sense of the perspective of the author or the text. And then they can ask that question, whose voice is missing from here and whose voices are we hearing? When they read explanations, arguments, news reports, we ask them to find sentences that begin with transition words or introductory phrases and look at what key ideas. So those of you who know SFL know we're asking them to think about marked themes and find marked themes in the text and think about why the authors use that transition to move on to the next sentence. So you can see we're drawing their attention to different meanings in the source, meanings that then orient them to disciplinary ways of thinking about historical agency and perspective, as well as text structure.
Sorry, Mary, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Laura. So I am coming to a conclusion here, coming back again to this idea that key ideas for us are context of culture, the bigger culture of education in general, and what we need to do to change that. Also the context of our culture, or the culture from which the sources from the investigations are coming. And then the context of situation, the place where we can really intervene and work toward instantiating different kinds of meanings in classroom interaction that show everyone a different vision of what a classroom can be and what education can be. As we do that, we're shifting dimensions of field, tenor, and mode to center students and center student talk, because that's a very powerful way for teachers to start listening to what students' perspectives are, and teachers are finding very interesting new insights coming from students. And then having students engage in analysis of text guided by our knowledge of discourse semantics and metafunction. And I'll just add that to work with teachers then, we're also shifting the way of doing professional development by going into classrooms to do our professional development days, where we go in groups into the classroom, we sit with students, we co-teach, planning beforehand about who will do different parts of the lesson, and then listening to what students are saying as they're reading the sources and talking together. And teachers are learning a lot from that, and we're learning new ways of supporting teachers in professional development through our ongoing design-based research on that topic. So I work with a great team of people in the Read, Inquire, Write, Teaching, Reasoning, and Inquiry in Social Studies project, and am grateful to our funders and the teachers and students who collaborated with us. So thank you very much for your interest in my work.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, everyone. Bueno, Mary, como ella misma decía, nos plantea volver a conceptos básicos.
Like Mary was saying, she is proposing to going back to basic concepts of teaching, like the view from above that Cristina Boccia was mentioning.
permite que seamos los docentes, como decía
And
anteriormente,
that allows us as
los que
teachers
tenemos la voz
to,
y la palabra,
to be the ones that
de expresarse a los
give the
estudiantes.
opportunity to students to express themselves.
Con esto creo que
With,
volvemos a pasar
with
un paso
this,
por lo que
I
dijo
believe
lo que refirió
you also are
la
referring to what
apertura,
Meg was saying,
a lo que dijo Viviana recién en la apertura,
what Viviana said in the aperture of the conference. So with this, we'll start
recibiremos preguntas de la
discussing with the panel
audiencia
members.
a través
We
del
receive questions from the
canal de
audience
YouTube,
through the YouTube channel and YouTube chat.
así que dejamos
So
la palabra a ustedes. No sé si los panelistas quieren hacer alguna reflexión, alguno de ustedes.
maybe the panel members would like to do some
O si
reflections,
les surge alguna pregunta.
or perhaps you want me to ask you some questions.
José David.
No, está bien, está bien. Las preguntas están bien. Bienvenidas.
Oh, yes. Your questions are
Bueno,
welcome.
voy a hacer una pregunta yo y después hay una del chat.
Well, I'll start with my question and then I'll read the chat. Some of your proposals are about the role of meta-language, but some others don't directly mention it. What's the place for meta-language for all your different proposals? Could you expand on that idea? You have probably thought about them while working in your presentations. The question is for any of you four.
I can respond. Just in looking at Mary's slides there, the idea without the idea of an actor, right? I mean, we know what meta language underlies that from an SFL perspective, but the word actor, a participant, we could look at a participant, but the idea of an actor, that is something that is you're naming something. It may not be strict SFL meta language, but you're naming the function of that that participant in a way that's very transparent to a teacher, to a student, and therefore allows them to, in the work that I've done with this, it allows them to develop some, if they're language learners, you could have some literal interpretation of what this word means. You could, or noun group perhaps, and then some inferences about it. And then the discussion of why this choice and not another. And to me, that allows for the kind of critical analysis that leads to the changing of context of culture that Mary has described. And in my work, that diagram about the institutional, I came at this through Fairclough and the idea of institutional discourses, macro discursive formations, and then how those are mediated by teachers who, that's what teachers have to do. They have to mediate all of that in a way that resonates with Jose's work within those activity triangles. That then leads to the types of texts, whether it's a spoken transcript or whether it's a type of text that's orally or multimedially produced. But the context of culture, it's in thinking about these, the context of culture in my lifetime has changed so radically just in the 20 years that I've been at UMass. And so one of the projects I'm thinking about taking up in the future is really looking at my own a lit review, but also looking at what are those texts, because context of culture is made up of texts, right? It's not disembodied from text, but it is. So what are these texts that have really changed teacher education, and not just in the US, but elsewhere in terms of standardization, accountability, scripted, boxed curriculum. So I'm curious what the other panelists think about the idea of what text do you look at in thinking about the context of culture of language education, teaching, reading, writing, world language.
Los dejo que contesten a Meg.
I could go back to, maybe puedo volver a la pregunta de Laura sobre el metalenguaje, si puedo
I could go
asociar.
back to the question that Laura made about metalanguage, making connections to what we are trying to do, and then go back to what Meg was proposing.
Great.
I believe metalanguage that we use with our teachers, and that we hope that is also applied in classes with students, is part of what we want to do, and if we want of what we want that we want that students and teachers understand and use. We need to have a language to talk about language, and theory proposes a functional language that is oriented to what we want to reflect, luckily. I think metalanguage is a fundamental tool, and I think that this is related to what José David was saying about how we want teachers to think about their tasks. It's not only about teaching texts or genres, it's to teach literacy, and we need a language to talk about it. I think it's unavoidable that we use metalanguage. Of course, by metalanguage, we're talking about the conception of language as a functional metalanguage that is transparent with a limited criteria. I think it's a tool that sheds light and does not complicate matters if we use it correctly.
Hay otra pregunta del chat, pero Meg había dejado algo planteado. No sé si queremos.
There's another question, but Meg also has
We can stay on metalanguage too. I
some
mean, if
questions.
that's if other people wanted to speak to that.
Sí, me gustaría ligar el tema del metalenguaje
Yes,
a la
I would like to link metalanguage to Mariana's question from the chat.
la teoría de la actividad hacia el aprendizaje expansivo.
How do you explain going from the theory of activity to expansive learning? I think one of the fundamental things there is reconceptualizing how we understand our roles. It's one of the things that we need to learn and that we learned with our projects. Teachers recognize themselves as language teachers, and they see
de sociología o de química o de ciencias sociales. Yo creo que ese momento es el paso de entrada hacia expandir el sistema de su actividad, que es toda la idea del aprendizaje expansivo. Y un elemento clave allí es el metalenguaje, es poder tener un idioma para hablar de los textos que llevo a mi clase. Entonces, allí desde ese punto de vista, el metalenguaje ayuda a teorizar el lenguaje, ¿cierto? A conceptualizar el lenguaje. Pero esa teorización de la que habla este aprendizaje expansivo, para seguir respondiendo a la pregunta de Mariana, iría más allá de conceptualizar los textos con metalenguaje, sino conceptualizar mi propia actividad, teorizarla, poder tomar mi propia práctica como docente y analizarla con las categorías, en este caso las que propone la teoría de la actividad, estas categorías teóricas de sujeto, herramientas, comunidad y demás. Porque en últimas lo que se está buscando también es que tanto docentes como estudiantes se apropien, en el caso del metalenguaje, para hablar de lo que quieren hacer y así poder construir comunidad. Entonces, hacia eso va el aprendizaje expansivo. En últimas, creo yo, es pasar como de mirar el aprendizaje como algo individual y más como un proceso colectivo, producto de todo este proceso de teorización, reflexión y demás. Creo que hasta ahí respondí la primera parte de tu pregunta, Mariana. Un elemento para atender la última parte de la pregunta, si me lo permiten. Mariana pregunta sobre qué cosas facilitan el proceso de aprendizaje expansivo y qué factores lo restringen o lo limitan. Nosotros hemos aprendido, obviamente necesitamos estudiarlo mucho más para poderlo confirmar. El hecho de que estudiantes y profesores tengan un motivo significativo para actuar, creo que ha sido como las herramientas más importantes para que puedan dar el paso de intentar cambiar su praxis. Y ese motivo no lo podemos suministrar nosotros como investigadores. Tiene que ser un motivo que los mismos docentes participantes de nuestros proyectos desarrollen. En muchos casos los profes no han querido usar
In many cases,
Reading to Learn, así como lo plantea el ciclo.
teachers don't want to use reading to learn. They have made their own adaptations because they think they are much more significant.
Otros profesores, para hablar de qué limita la transformación,
In other cases, other teachers, to talk about what limits
porque la contradicción es muy
it,
fuerte.
they abandon their project because they have a big contradiction between what they think they have to do and what gender pedagogy proposes. For example, to start with text, to start with meaning, many haven't taken the step of leaving teaching grammar that is very, it's much, I mean, it's used a lot. It's very commonly used, teaching grammar. They separate themselves from grammar teaching. They don't want to.
Muchas gracias, José David. Bueno, hay muchos agradecimientos de distintas personas.
Thank you, José David. We have many thanks from people in YouTube. I would like to make a question that is about the role of students and teachers in this as a center that has been discussed in many different ways by different authors for many years, and there are many differences in the ways to understand it. I would like to know what you think about it, how you understand it, what's the relevance of their roles. Perhaps Mary, who hasn't been speaking, would like to say something.
So maybe I can approach that question by saying just a couple words about meta-language too, because that's a question when you're talking about what are the roles of teachers and students, and what are they going to be talking about, and so in my past experience, I've done a lot of work with meta-language and working in contexts where teachers were language teachers or they were teachers of literacy and reading. They need a meta-language for talking about language. It's not so true of the middle school social studies teacher that they recognize that they need a meta-language for talking about language. And also our challenge was to create materials that would guide the teacher to be asking questions, doing things in the classroom that would accomplish the goals we had without being able to necessarily do professional development. The materials themselves have to be educative in that sense, that they lead the teachers to engage in certain activities and ask certain kinds of questions. Now, of course, the teacher can still do whatever they want. So as some of you have said, the teachers don't do just exactly what the materials guide them to do. But that's really the goal right now, and to infuse a kind of a meta-language of transition words, actors, thinking, doing, being, that relates to what we know is meaningful in the text for students to be talking about, and then put people in a position where the activity sequence engages them in talk about text and about what they're learning. And so we want to change the roles of teachers and students in getting them to talk more and just to have more talk in the classroom. We feel that that's really a way of learning. It's really based on Ruqaiya Hassan's ideas that teachers need to listen to students and really connect with what students are saying if we're going to be helping them to become people who can change society.
Thank you very much, Mary. Anybody else want to say something about this? Cristina?
I'm okay for now. Thank you.
Okay, so, perdón. Hay otra pregunta en el chat.
There's another question in the chat, if you don't want to add anything else, for José David. Question is, do you think it's a challenge to use the model of active system with the genre pedagogy model, considering the role of language in their base theories? Mainly, I would think that there's a lot of things that complement each other because pedagogy theory has a lot of cultural elements. It's about mediation, scaffolding, and language has a mediator role. I think it would be a logical step trying to do that integration. The challenge that I think might exist is the complexity of both theories. Trying to use systemic theories and also activity theory with all their elements. It's a very big challenge, and I think a further challenge that has been the most important for us, and it might not be completely related to the idea of language and the role of language, is that is to be able to take teaching pedagogy and let teachers decide whether to adopt it or not. Sometimes they won't adopt that pedagogy literally. That is a problem we have in our studies because it's built collectively, and the investigator does not have the position of being the expert, of being the one that should be followed. And others might decide that they don't want genre pedagogy and that they would like to change or find another way of teaching. I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we found.
Bueno, yo como para ir terminando, ya que el tema del panel es la formación docente, ¿no? La formación de profesores, bueno, tal vez podíamos hacer una reflexión.
Perhaps we can reflect, do a final reflection about this that can be guided by something that you already have in plan. I can let you know that once we interviewed Holiday, he told us that he thought that teacher development was most important than initial development, and it should happen 5 years after the teacher was actually teaching and found his or her problems and their questions, and that's when the teacher is ready to have a postgraduate degree or an activity or an in-service training. That could be an idea, but what do you think that is most relevant, or how do you like to close this thinking about teaching formation, teachers formation? I believe that it's very inspiring. Mary's ideas are very inspiring. They resonate with me thinking in my own teaching activity. This idea of revisiting I believe that it's very inspiring. I think it's very productive to speak with the teachers that we work with, and I believe that it would be very organizing of changes that intuitively we try to have with our students, but sometimes theory organizes us and enriches us. So I'm taking these ideas, very beautiful, Mary. All of the ideas, I believe, I learned from all of them, but they resonated a lot with what I think. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Anybody else?
Yeah.
We have a comment.
Okay, go ahead, Meg. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's with in-service teachers, the professional development that I've done, whether it's grant funded or it's mostly been grant funded, which is a problem, honestly. Like, why is it grant funded? Like, soft money doesn't really give you much to build on. But they have developed problems of practice that they do want to explore. And when some of them see, and those who don't, start to see other teachers with whom they work really have a different orientation to students, to their content, to designing lessons that can really take off in a way that sells itself. With in-service, with pre-service teachers, I've come to believe increasingly that it's who we recruit and admit into the profession. Increasingly, I don't, if somebody comes in with very racist ideologies around language and learning and where the problem is located, there's not much I can do, particularly in a one-year program. You know, if they're in a one-year program where they're taking courses, doing everything, like it's drinking water from a fire hydrant, I'm not going to change that much. But if I can get a handle on who's admitted, who's funded and recruited, I can build on their already lived experiences. And I think that's another place where the administrator, me, the institutional gatekeeper, me, can really try to change things in ways that are material immediately.
Gracias, Meg. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you very much. Anything else that you would like to add to close? I would like to read Maria Brist's words.
Wonderful panel in education, inspiring. Thank you very much.
I would just like to say that we have such a powerful theory, and there's so much we can do with it at the micro level, and thinking in big ways as well. And it's really inspiring to me to hear these presentations from different parts of the world and see people using the key concepts of the theory to guide their practice in their specific place where they have their own constraints to work on, and to see what's common across us all as we're working together. I'm just leaving tonight feeling really inspired.
Muchas gracias, Mary.
Thank you very much, Mary. I believe that undoubtedly every work has been inspired, removing, and brought fresh works of investigation and reflection and reading. So it's been a privilege to being here with you. I'm thought of. Thank you very much. Thank you. If anyone wants to add anything else, if not, we are the ones that are thankful. Mariana and me are really proud of having you all here and for you to accept our invitations. Okay, so we're closing the panel here, and in 5 minutes, we meet again for the closing activity, not ceremony. Thank you very much.
Buenas noches a todos y
Good
todas.
evening to everyone. We're closing this Congress that we had more than 400 people participating with over 130 exposition from Latin America, Africa, USA, and Europe. The Congress brought an opportunity of learning and imagining new futures where linguistic education and communication we can contribute to the construction of a new society in alignment with the. Good evening, and thank you very much to all of us that walked with us in these 3 days. I want to start off thanking to the professor, Dr. Laura Flores, who on the second time she took the challenge of organizing the conference of ALSFAL in 2012. She organized the first one, the number 8, that was successful, and she did it without any institutional help. And this year she brought in the community of systemic functional linguistic in Uruguay and had institutional support. Thank you very much, Laura, for challenging us and taking these tasks that look impossible but are achievable. Thank you.
Me gustaría entonces
I would like to say that for me, it's been a privilege working with Mariana Achua. I believe that after this, we can start any business. We've been a good couple. We've been through a lot. So creativity and academic in Mariana, and the capacity of solving problems, any type of problems. It's been a pleasure, and she made this possible. So thank you very much, Mariana Choa. Right now, we're going to talk about everybody else that worked with us and made this possible. Starting off, the institutions that we represent: FIC, Consejo Formación en Educación of ANEP, where I work, Scientific Committee of every academic in the ALSFAL community that reviewed all the works, the Executive Committee of ALSFAL that helped us in this endeavor. We want to highlight the work of the teachers of the pre-Congress courses,
Cristina Boccia, Susan Field, Helen Harper, y Sally Humphrey. Muchas gracias a todos ellos.
Thank you to all of them. We would like to thank the colleagues that gave the plenary conferences and the participant of the invited panels: Jean Martin, Adriana Bolivar, Virginia Zavala, Ruth Harman, Teresa Teiza, Cecilia Colombi, Maria Brisk, Gillian Moss, Christian Fusser, Millie Schleppegrell, José David Herazo, and Cristina Bosch. Treasury and accounting of FIC that helped us with the accountant. Also to Valeria from the Executive Committee of ALSFAL that helped us the PayPal payment also. The website designer of CFE, Pierina, the communication part of the University of Republic, Leroy and Nicolas, that are making this transmission possible and did all the streaming every day. Also Carolina Suelso from media that was here on the first day. Interdisciplinary nucleus of the University of the Republic, the technical assistance with the virtual classes, University of Santiago de Chile, particularly Ana Laura Márquez, interpretation students of University of Santiago de Chile, and IPA in Uruguay. And we have tonight Bernardo Rodriguez and Romina Gargaglioni that have been translating nonstop today, and Ramon Silveira for the streaming organization and the programmation that helped us to think about what was coming. Thank you very much. Also to the moderators of the simultaneous sessions, colleagues in the of IPA, and other teachers that made the everyday work, the assistants of the pre-Congress courses, and all of the attendees of the conferences, especially the support groups of the organization that have been working voluntarily for many times intensively, those that coordinated the pre-Congress groups, Cecilia Preto and Maria Elena Buña, those who worked in the summaries, Bruno Marín, Lucia Rojo, Valentina Perine, and Martina Fernandez, the group that worked with the programs, Serrana Chenaucia, that was moderator on the first session also, and Andrea Ribeiro, and the communication group with Mariana and me, we want to highlight the professionalism and the constant and unconditionally support of Valentina Perini throughout this month, the assistance with the website and network of Martina Fernandez, also very intense, particularly in the last weeks. Being said, and with all this thinking, we give you our colleagues of University of Cuyo and University of La Pampa, who are going to be in charge of the next organization of ALSFAL 2022. Thank you very much, Laura and Mariana. We thank you for the quality and the warmth that you've organized this Congress. You've invited us and hold us, plus the pre-Congress last week. It's a huge responsibility to take the next Congress. And here we are only 3 visible faces, the faces that you've seen the longest, almost 20 years that we've seen each other in different Congress, and we're going to kick off new generations, new faces. And I invite Paola, if you want to share some words, and then a video inviting everyone to the next Congress. Thank you, Samia. Thank you to all of you that have done this Congress possible. Honestly, we're very happy to receive you all and wait for you in Mendoza, shared with La Pampa. I, along with Sami and Cristina, had the opportunity of working in the first Congress that we organized in 2004. I was also in the one in 2014, so I'm happy of sharing the knowledge and how the systemic it's developing and expanding across the world. Now we share the video.
Nos da mucha alegría en esta ocasión invitarlos a la 17ª conferencia de ALSFAL, que se desarrollará de manera virtual en 2 sedes, la Universidad Nacional de La Pampa y la Universidad Nacional de Cuyo. La Universidad Nacional de La Pampa se ubica precisamente en Santa Rosa, provincia de La Pampa, de Argentina, en el norte de la región Patagonia. La Universidad Nacional de Cuyo se ubica en la ciudad de Mendoza, al centro-oeste de Argentina, al pie de los Andes. Ambas son universidades nacionales y públicas. Específicamente, la organización estará a cargo de profesores de la Facultad de Ciencias Humanas, del Departamento de Lenguas Extranjeras y del Departamento de Letras de la Universidad de La Pampa, y de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, Departamento de Inglés en la Universidad Nacional de Cuyo. En este momento en el que estamos comenzando a salir de la crisis sanitaria, nos queda la crisis social, económica y la incertidumbre política por transitar. Es por esto que podemos comprometernos a trabajar en la modalidad virtual, tomando la experiencia de Montevideo como un excelente punto de partida. Estamos también muy entusiasmadas con la oportunidad de poder trabajar de forma conjunta con nuestros colegas de la Universidad Nacional de La Pampa, ya que las instituciones en las que trabajamos están de hecho vinculadas en ALSFAL. Aún debemos acordar varios detalles, como el tema de la conferencia y la fecha exacta, pero sí podemos adelantar que nuestro congreso será seguramente en esta misma época del año. Si bien esperamos que pronto podamos retomar nuestros encuentros en persona, disfrutar de reencontrarnos y de conversar, ponernos al día, establecer nuevos lazos, nos parece que podemos también sacar provecho de los beneficios de la modalidad virtual. Esperamos entonces contar con la participación de un gran número de colegas a quienes de este modo se les facilite participar y nutrirse de los cursos precongresos y del congreso mismo. Los esperamos.
Bueno, yo quisiera para despedirnos como palabras
I'd like to say goodbye, to say some final words. Thank the help of Dr. José David Herazo, President of ALSFAL, who will also be there with you next year. And it's also been important to count with your support and your trust, José David. It has been a pleasure. Then, without any further ado, we say goodbye, thanking to all the institutions that have contributed to this event. See you next year.
Bravo, chicas.